So that's 5:01, so we will now start the conversation. My name is Susan Murray and I'm Director of the David Hume Institute, and I am delighted that you can join us this afternoon. From looking at the guest list, we have some old friends and some very new faces, so we're delighted that you have come. It should be a fascinating discussion from across the pond. Ben is joining us from Harvard Library, as you can see in his background. And Katherine, I'm delighted you're here to host the conversation. You're one of Scotland's most eminent political economists, I think, at the moment, and your commentary seems to be in so many conversations. So for you to host this conversation, we're really, really pleased you're here. I'm just going to do a little bit of housekeeping to start off with. We are recording the session, so we're doing that so that we can make it available afterwards for those who haven't been able to make it. Ben's going to talk with Katherine for around about 30 minutes, and then we're going to open it up to questions. So if you have a question you think about as Ben's talking and you'd like to post it in the Q&A section, please do, and we'll be selecting the questions from the Q&A bit, which is at the bottom of your screen on Zoom if you've not used it before. At the end of the discussion, the votes of thanks will be given by Ken Barker. Ken has been a trustee of the David Hume Institute for the last 3 years, and we're delighted to announce today that Ken will be taking over the chair when Sir John stands down at the end of March, at the end of his term. So we have huge thanks to John for everything he's done to help us along the road, but we're also very pleased to announce that Ken will be becoming the chair, and you are the first people to know that because we haven't announced it publicly before. So without further ado, over to Katherine to start the conversation.
Thank you, Susan, and let me add my welcome to everyone who's joined us today, and particularly to Professor Friedman. Welcome virtually to Scotland. It's absolutely wonderful to have you with us online. I think everyone's very much looking forward to hearing your thoughts. I want to just let folks know a tiny bit about you. Professor Friedman is the William Joseph Meyer Professor at Harvard University, where he's worked and taught for several decades. And during that time, he's published over 15 books, more than 150 journal articles. And his latest book, the book called Religion and the Rise of Capitalism, is quite literally a hefty tome. Even though I received a virtual electronic copy, it landed with a thud in my inbox. It's well over 500 pages, and it's got some just really delicious links to Scottish history. So I think the contents is going to be of interest of anyone who's interested in global affairs, in economic affairs, but it's really nice that it's got such a nice Scottish element to that. So as Susan said, what's going to happen, we're going to talk for about half an hour, and then very much we want to open it up to all of you who are with us this evening. So please be thinking of your questions. Do put them in the Q&A because that's where they'll be picked up. And then when the time comes, I'll call on you and you'll be able to take yourself off mute and speak to Professor Friedman directly. So let's get started. And Professor Friedman, I want to start with a little bit about the journey and the genesis of the book, if you'll excuse that pun. And really just reflect, if you can, on where this book emerged from in your career and what really sparked this idea of this particular topic that led you to put finger to keyboard and create such an extraordinary contribution.
Well, first of all, thank you, Katherine, for engaging in this conversation with me. And thank you, Susan, for hosting me at the David Hume Institute. And I thank also my friend, Lord Woolman, for making the contact that made all this possible. I'm absolutely delighted to be with you. Now, Katherine, as to the question you asked, I'm an economist. As you politely hinted, I've been at it for a long time. You said several decades. That's a euphemism. This is actually year number 49 for me, teaching economics on the Harvard faculty. And as a longtime economist, I often have wondered where our economics came from. Why is it that we economists tend to think as we do? Now, when I say we economists, I mean Western modern economists. I'm well aware that there are other lines of economic thinking, but that's not what we teach at Harvard. I'm guessing that's not what they teach at Edinburgh. And so I wanted to know where our economics came from. And as I looked into this, I came up with what to me was a surprising conclusion. Everybody understands that Adam Smith, in his great book, The Wealth of Nations in 1776, was the pioneering contribution. And I agreed with that. That's to me, that's clear. But then the question is, what enabled Smith and his contemporaries, importantly, including his friend and mentor, David Hume, what enabled these people at that time and in that place to come to this rather remarkable set of insights? The harder I looked, the more I persuaded myself that they were responding to and they were enabled by new religious thinking that was coming into prominence in the English-speaking Protestant world, of which they were very much a part, even though they were not religiously committed individuals themselves, and that in a way that we don't talk about at all, therefore, religious thinking was an important driver and enabler of the economic thinking. Usually we recognize that economics is a product of the Enlightenment, in which Smith and Hume and these other figures were so important. And we therefore today think that economics must therefore have had nothing to do with religion, because today we often think of the Enlightenment as a turn away from a God-centered view of the universe toward what we now call secular humanism. And these people were part of the Enlightenment, no question about it. But I think their ideas, their insights were powerfully enabled by religious thinking. And that's a new thing to suggest.
Fantastic. And if folks are thinking about picking up your book, what are some of the key ideas, or I guess even new perspectives that you're hoping that readers will take away from sifting through the pages and digesting the contents?
The number one would be, as I've just explained, that economics is not just a secular set of ideas coming out of the Enlightenment, but rather something, a line of thinking that was powerfully enabled by the religious ideas of that time and of that place. But second, that this initial from the ground up influence of religious thinking was not just a matter of the late 18th century. After all, Adam Smith died in 1790. I think the influence of religious thinking on how economists have thought has resonated right down through the 19th and the 20th centuries. And it's present with us today, especially in the United States. It would be interesting to know if a Scotsman, for example, or an Englishman engaged in this inquiry would have come up with the answer that I did. But especially for an American, it's very clear that the role of religious thinking in driving economic thinking is very important today in our modern day discussion of economics, our debate over economic policy in the United States. We often puzzle over why so many of my fellow Americans seem to vote and even to think in ways that are sharply counter to their personal economic self-interest. I think religious thinking provides a key to understanding this puzzle, and that's useful, especially here in my country, for trying to address public policy issues. I'd highlight those as the principal ideas that I would like people to take away from this book.
Fantastic. And let me just pick up on that last point there. I want to read from your text. At the very beginning, you talk about how ideas operate, and I love this sentence. Probably one of my favorite sentences in the book. You say, ideas operate over the heads of the participants, guiding both their thinking and their choices in ways that they cannot foresee and that we cannot explain. And then later on, towards the end of the book, you go a little bit more specific on that idea, and you said there's this puzzling behavior of citizens whose attitudes to economic policy do not align with their economic benefit. And I think that's a really fascinating observation, particularly as we've watched from afar some of the political machinations in the US over the last few years. And you speak really about how many people in the US oppose the raising of the top rate of income tax and wealth tax, perhaps despite the fact that they're not in those income cohorts. And I guess I was left wondering, is it a matter of faith on their part that at some point they will be rich enough to be in that top cohort? And I guess really what explains some of that apparently paradoxical behavior?
I don't think it's a matter of their believing that they will make it into the top income brackets. In the United States, most people's income and wealth trajectory is pretty well set by the time they're in their late 20s or early 30s. There are, of course, exceptions, phenomenally successful entrepreneurs, people who strike it rich in the lottery. But for the great majority of people, they know by age 30 whether they're going to be among the super rich or not. This is a great puzzle, you see. Citizens of states like Kentucky and Mississippi are far more likely than ordinary Americans elsewhere to draw on programs of support like food stamps or public housing or supplemental income support. And yet, overwhelmingly, they vote for candidates who would like to gut those programs. You cited the wealth tax. We don't have wealth taxes here, but we do have an inheritance tax. This is an extremely interesting example. Only about 5,000 families a year in the United States have to pay any inheritance, any estate tax. It's a tax on the estate, not on the inheritance. But nonetheless, according to the most recent polls, 48% of all Americans, 48%, would like to abolish the estate tax altogether, not just raise the minimum. Minimum is already at $22 million per couple, but would like to abolish it altogether. And then what's especially puzzling is that particular religious groups are at the forefront of this opposition to estate taxation. Now, you can't explain that just by pointing to people's being misguided and thinking they're somehow going to accumulate enormous amounts of money. The heart of the puzzle are evangelical Protestants. For most people, it's not surprising that opposition to estate taxation here correlates well with people's incomes. Republicans have higher than average incomes. They have higher than average opposition to estate taxation. Democrats, the reverse. What's really striking is that evangelical Protestants have distinctly lower than average incomes on average, much lower than Democrats, and yet they have higher than average opposition to estate taxation. Well, where does that come from? I argued that the standard explanations for our politics based in the usual political science just can't get at it. And we just have to look back to these religious origins of economic thinking in order to be able to explain phenomena like that.
It's absolutely fascinating, and there's so many different directions I would love to take the conversation, particularly really reflecting on what we've been seeing in US politics. But I want to come back very much to the book itself. And one of the areas you note, and you've hinted at this already, is how almost the US is the exception that proves the rule in terms of the decline of religious observance as incomes of a country go up. And I'd love you to reflect on that a little bit more, and perhaps the contrast between the US and other countries where we've seen perhaps a more general pattern of decline of religiosity, if you like, as countries become more economically developed, at least.
Catherine, if we had been having this conversation 50 years ago or even 30 years ago, one thing we would have talked about was the so-called secularization hypothesis, the idea that as the Western countries move to ever higher incomes, they would lose their attachment to religious belief, religious observance, religious commitment. Now, in many countries outside the United States, my observation certainly is this is true in the UK, but true in France, other European countries, that that's been true by and large. The secularization hypothesis has been right, but it has not been right in the United States. And so today, as opposed to 30 years ago, if you hear Americans talking about the secularization hypothesis, what they are talking about is trying to explain why it didn't happen in this country. And there are a whole variety of explanations to which people point, have some having to do with historical grounding of the founding of our republic. This is something I talk about in my book, some having to do with other aspects of the American experience. I don't pretend to be a sociologist, I'm an economist, and so I, in the book, don't get into the question of why the United States is such an exception. I simply take it as given that we are. And the fact that we are turns out to be an important driver of the relevance today for our politics, for our public discussion of economics, of this influence on religious thinking. It would be interesting to explain why we are such an exception in this regard, but I think I'll leave that one to the sociologists.
And there might be some in the audience, so if folks do have their own theories, please do share them via question in the Q&A, and we'll come to that in the discussion later. I want to, I guess, in honor of our host, particularly David Hume is certainly one of the heroes of the book in a way, and not least via his influence on our famous son here in Glasgow of Adam Smith. And I'd love you just to talk a little bit more, because you do give such a lovely account of their relationship and some of the anecdotes of how they caught up and debated and so on. I think it's just really one of the most interesting aspects of some of the conversation that you take us through. But could you reflect on their relationship and the influence on each other, but then also its significance for economic thinking?
It must have been a very beautiful friendship. Hume was a dozen years older than Smith. He was clearly Smith's intellectual mentor. Many people believe, and I do not disagree, that the whole project that Smith was engaged in of trying to produce a science of man comparable to what Newton had done nearly a century earlier for the science of the physical universe, was a project that Hume put him up to. This was Hume's idea. Hume wrote about it, and many people think that Smith was in fact acting on Hume's inspiration. Much of what's in Smith was clearly inspired by Hume. Even the title of the book, very interestingly, we today just naturally understand that if we're talking about the wealth of a nation, we're not talking about the gold and silver in the treasury's vaults. We're talking about the standard of living of the population. Well, that was a new idea, but it was a new idea of Hume. That was Hume's essay on the populousness of ancient nations. So lots of these central ideas came from Hume. Now, you asked about their personal friendship. It must have been quite lovely. The two men were on, Hume lived in Edinburgh, and during the period when Smith was the professor of moral philosophy at Glasgow, the two men were on sufficiently close terms that Hume kept a special room in his lodgings, so that when Smith came over from Glasgow, which he did frequently to go to lunches, dinners at the Select Society, which both men belonged to, they would, Smith would just stay overnight with Hume. So they imagine having a friend on such close terms that you would keep a special room in your house just so that
I think in today we call that a bromance.
just so that a person could stay. The most touching aspect of their friendship is that after Hume died, Smith wrote a public letter defending his friendship with Smith and with Hume. As Smith wrote the letter defending his friendship with Hume, and especially Hume, had been this outspoken skeptic, agnostic. Most people think he was an atheist. I certainly think so. And for that reason, he was always turned down for academic appointments. He was never, ever able to get an academic appointment at the university in Edinburgh. And therefore, he's a very controversial figure. But Smith wrote this long letter, printed, it's about 6-8 pages, defending Hume and just saying he was the person he knew whose life comported the most with what we take to be religious principles. And then poor Smith suffered terribly for that letter. He later said that he has this famous statement that he took more abuse for writing that one letter than he did for his entire book's attack on the English economic system. So the two men must have been just absolutely marvelous to sit with them at the Select Society or elsewhere and participate in this intellectual but also very personal relationship between the two men.
And in terms of how those ideas then filtered into even today's economic thinking, can you really see some golden threads from they're sitting around a table, probably drinking claret back in the day, to how we think about economics now?
Well, both men were enormously influential. To repeat, Smith was the creator of modern economics by coming to the insight that it's the competitive market mechanism that enables individuals acting on nothing more than their own self-interest to make other people better off. Other people had the idea that that was possible before. In the English-speaking world, Bernard Mandeville had the idea as early as 1705. Back in the 1680s, the Frenchman Pierre Nicole had said the same thing. And so why is it that we don't think of Nicole or Mandeville as the father of modern economics? The reason is that they had no sense whatsoever of how this came about. It was like a mathematician being able to state a theorem without proving it. And the great contribution of Smith was not only to realize that it was the competitive market mechanism that delivered this outstanding result, but then to show very, very carefully in The Wealth of Nations how this was true, and moreover to do it in a way that was intellectually satisfactory to a generation that had been educated in Newtonian ideas of system and mechanism. By the time Smith was an undergraduate, Smith was born in 1723. By the time he was an undergraduate in the 1730s, Newton's Principia Mathematica was part of the standard curriculum at every Scottish university, part of the standard curriculum at Cambridge, not Oxford, probably why Oxford lagged behind for so many decades, even centuries in scientific accomplishment. But Smith really had it. Now, as to Hume, Hume did not have that insight. There's nothing on this in Hume, but in so many other respects, many of Hume's essays are still the basis of our modern monetary thinking, our modern thinking about international trade. So both men were just powerfully influential.
And you mentioned earlier how Smith really, and because perhaps of his listening to David Hume, he really understood that the wealth of nations is not purely what you can tally up in terms of gold and silver. And those of us in Scotland are really talking a lot about now is what is the real wealth of nations. We're having a conversation about wealth of nations 2.0. This feeds into discussions about going beyond GDP. And I work for an organization that talks a lot about a well-being economy, and I like to remind people that in Old English, the original meaning for the word wealth was the conditions of well-being, and that's our human capital, our social capital, our environmental capital, and so on. And if we'd only take stock of that, we'd have a much fuller picture of how our country's standing, its standard of living, as you said. And yet, despite that, I guess, awakening, so often, so many of Smith's ideas are misconstrued, perhaps deliberately, I'd say, by some people who want to have him on their argumentative side, but perhaps utilize his thinking in perhaps a slightly spurious way. And it would be great if you really think about, or share with us a little bit about your thoughts on why Smith still matters so much in this day and age, and given the pressures and challenges still emerging, in the midst of a pandemic, climate emergency. What should we really be learning from these great scholars?
Well, to begin, Catherine, what you said about well-being is absolutely what Smith says in The Wealth of Nations. He again and again and again says that no nation can be considered happy or successful or wealthy if the vast majority of the laboring population is poor and miserable. So again, this is the Hume idea that it's the standard of living of the broad bulk of the population that matters. Now, I think you're quite right that many people, especially on the political right today, misconstrue Smith. Here in the United States, we often see, especially at economics related meetings, but in political circles as well, we often see people wearing Adam Smith neckties. My assumption when I see a person wearing an Adam Smith necktie is that this is somebody who's heard of The Wealth of Nations but never read it, and probably never heard of the theory of moral sentiments. Smith had this insight about the role of the competitive market mechanism, and of course, for that reason, he was opposed to impediments to the market mechanism. He was opposed to mercantilism. He was opposed to government-granted monopolies. He had lots of scathing things to say about the tendency of businessmen, merchants, as he called them, to enter into combinations, as we would put it today, to collude. But Smith did not see the competitive market mechanism as some hothouse flower that was so fragile we had to defend it against any interference. Instead, what impressed Smith was the remarkable robustness of this mechanism. And because he thought it was so robust, he was perfectly prepared to support all sorts of interferences. So for example, when I see somebody wearing an Adam Smith necktie, I'm very tempted to walk up to the person and say, I see you're in favor of progressive income taxes. Because of course, Smith was in favor of progressive income taxes. Smith was in favor of luxury taxes on expensive carriages that rich people rode around in. So think of him as favoring luxury taxes on people who drive around in Rolls Royces and Bentleys and BMWs and Mercedeses. And he was explicit that the purpose of the luxury tax would be to alleviate the poverty and the suffering of the poor. Smith was in favor of whiskey taxes and taxes on distilleries. I assume that must have been a pretty bold thing to do in Scotland. Smith was in favor of much tighter regulation on banking than certainly anything we've had in the United States within my lifetime. And in each of these cases, it was because he thought there was some public purpose to be served. And if this was an infringement on the competitive market mechanism, so be it, precisely because the mechanism was so powerful, to use his phrase, so robust, that it didn't matter in the end. So I think you're right that lots of people misuse Smith. Incidentally, there is a view that this misuse of Smith goes way back and is a product of the English reaction to the French Revolution. That apparently that's where it started. People wanted to be very sure that Smith's ideas were not going to be associated with anything that could be construed as having to do with revolutionary France, and therefore one view is that the misrepresentation started extremely early.
Oh, that's absolutely fascinating. And I think one of the other aspects I appreciate about Smith is he clearly had an understanding of the impact of relative poverty as well, when he talked about the importance of the linen shirt and being able to go about in your community with sufficient attributes. The linen shirt was his example, so you didn't look obviously poor, and there are certain aspects of consumption that we needed to be able to participate in society. And I think he certainly has a lot of ideas that are just only growing in relevance today. I want to open it up to audience questions in a minute, and just to remind everyone, please put your questions for Professor Friedman in the Q&A, and we'll turn to you and invite you in to ask them directly. But I want to just switch tack slightly for my final question around the question of slavery, because of course, given all the Black Lives Matter conversations last year, it is so very topical in both our countries. And it's certainly something that you don't shy away from in your book. And you really talk about how many people of these great economic scholars, from Smith and Wesley and Daniel Raymond, Francis Wayland, Francis Bowen, etc., opposed slavery for several reasons as well, both moral and economic. And I had a question really, is slavery a bit of a flashpoint where economics and religion collide?
I'm an American, and so for me, slavery is a flashpoint for everything. Slavery has absolutely dominated the discussion of the United States since there was a United States. You go back to the meeting of all of these Enlightenment figures in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787, they stewed endlessly over the matter of slavery. And of course, we had an astonishingly bloody civil war about it. The current estimates are that 750,000 people died in our civil war. That's in a population of 30 million people. So that would be equivalent to having 7.5 million deaths. So this was an astonishing episode for the United States, and the residue of slavery is, of course, still with us today. I don't think economists talk much about slavery, simply because rejection of slavery is now so built into the American political, social, intellectual struggle. But as we look back historically, it was the great issue in our country, and therefore, as you rightly point out, and as I emphasize in my book, many of our major economists back in the early days focused on slavery. So, for example, you mentioned Francis Wayland. Wayland was an interesting figure. Wayland wrote the best-selling economics textbook in the United States in the period before our Civil War. Didn't sell that many in the UK. In the UK, the best-selling book was, of course, John Stuart Mill's. But here it was Francis Wayland. And Wayland has a whole other book that he devotes to slavery. He was opposed to slavery. So it's a very major thing here in the United States. You also mentioned Wesley. I've always been curious, and in case there are any Smith biographical scholars listening in, let me pose a question to them. Smith and Wesley were contemporaries, both outspoken opponents of slavery. And the question I've always wondered is whether they interacted at all. Smith spent lots of time in London, and presumably Wesley was there at some of the times when Smith was there. So it would be interesting to know if the two men ever talked, and if so, whether slavery was a part of their conversation. But certainly Adam Smith was an outspoken opponent of slavery, and most, if not all, of the American economic descendants of Smith were as well.
Fantastic, thank you. Well, let's turn to our audience, who have got some questions coming in, and I'd encourage everyone to just put their questions in the Q&A. Unfortunately, the first question, though, is someone who is unable to take themselves off mute. So I'm going to ask Susan Murray from the David Hume Institute to share Adrian Shaw's question with us. And then after he's asked that, Ray Perman will be turning to you. But Susan first.
So Adrian Shaw would like to know, why, of all places, do you think that the new economic theory should emerge in Scotland in the mid-18th century rather than France or England or elsewhere? And was the new economics associated with the attitudes towards the environment, especially as a source of resources to be exploited?
Well, on the first part as to why it was Scotland, it certainly was not going to be France. I don't think that would have hit because, again, France was a Roman Catholic country, and therefore this contention over predestinarian Calvinism, which I emphasize in the book as the principal spur to the new economic thinking, was not going to be a factor in France. Now, it could well have been in England. The turn away from predestinarian Calvinism was a rolling matter. It was, of course, the issue or major part of the issue in the English Civil War, and then on into the latter half of the 17th century. This debate within the Church of Scotland was at its height in the middle of the 18th century. Importantly, the time when Smith and Hume were coming into young adulthood and forming their view of the world. And then in what I, as an American, regard as a very interesting way, it came to America in the latter half of the 18th century. So why didn't economics as we have it emerge then in England in the latter half of the 17th century? I don't know. It could well have, but it didn't. Maybe England at that time was still not yet enough of a commercial society to spawn this kind of thinking. Maybe the scars of the Civil War were too fresh. So it could have happened in England, but it didn't. And it happened in Scotland, and it happened in the middle of the 18th century. But looking at what was happening in Scotland then, both in terms of the development of the commercial economy and also what was on people's minds. After all, why did Scotland give up being an independent country in 1707? It had a lot to do with wanting to raise the standard of living up to what the English already had. And by 1750, it still hadn't happened. So people were very focused on economic issues at the time. That's why Hume, Smith, others, Adam Ferguson, were all focused on the question. Now, the second part of the question was about the environment, and I just don't think Smith had that idea in the same way that we do today. I think this is an addition to our thinking in the last, really not even the last 250 years, more than that, the last just 50 or 25 years. So I don't think Smith would have had a lot to say on the subject.
And of course, now so much of religious thinking is also inherent in some environmental movements too. So that can, maybe that's a future book for you, Professor Friedman, to explore the influence of religion on the environmental movement. But I'll turn to our next questioner. So this is Ray Perman. If you're able to come off mute and ask your question.
Yes, am I off mute now?
Go for it. We can hear you.
Professor Friedman, I'm fascinated by the subject, and I very much look forward to reading your book. I'm interested in why you chose the title you have chosen, considering it was the title of a very famous book by R.H. Tawney, and also why you write about the rise of capitalism when by the 18th century, certainly in Britain, capitalism was pretty firmly established, and there are a number of major corporations active both in London and in Scotland. In Scotland, including the banks and the British Linen Company, for example, the Glasgow tobacco barons, and so on. So it is why you came up with the title that you did.
Well, first of all, you're absolutely right. The imitation of Tawney was self-conscious and deliberate. This is the title of the set of lectures that Tawney gave in 1922, published as a book in 1926, and I quite deliberately took his title. But as I explain in the introduction to my book, I mean something different than Tawney meant. Tawney was reacting to Weber's book from 15 years earlier, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. And so Tawney was debating with Weber where capitalist economic behavior came from. And as you rightly point out, much of that had happened already before Adam Smith and David Hume's day. Weber focuses especially on the 17th century. Tawney takes the discussion back to the 16th century. My book is about capitalist economic thinking. There's a difference between talking about behavior and thinking. And so what I'm after is the origins of the thinking of the people whom we would all recognize as economists today. Now, I hope that's not misleading, but that's the title I chose, and I explain in the introduction that I mean something different from what Tawney and Weber meant.
Thank you. Ray, if you're still with us, do you want to follow up on that, or?
No, I very much look forward to reading the book. And without reading it, I can't really respond to that, but thank you very much for that answer.
Thanks ever so much.
If I may, another way to think about it is that Weber and Tawney were doing social history or business history or economic history, and I'm doing intellectual history here.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ray. And so the next question is from Tressa Tishtombo. I hope forgive me if I have mispronounced your surname. Tressa, are you able to come off mute and ask your question?
Hi.
Hello.
Thank you very much, Professor Friedman. So I really enjoyed the talk as much. I've just finished reading an interesting book by this American historian Arthur Herman, How the Scots Invented the Modern World. And he talked about, in long extent, about capitalism, how Adam Smith came up with the idea of writing the book, and it's quite interesting. So my question was, at what extent ideas in Wealth of the Nations have inherited from this idea of pursuit of happiness developed by Hutcheson, who was Adam Smith's master or teacher.
Well, how it relates to the pursuit of happiness is what you said?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's very closely related. The pursuit of happiness has a ring for us Americans. In our Declaration of Independence, the phrase by Jefferson is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which was a great shock to people because the standard expression in those days following John Locke would have been life, liberty, and property. That's what people were trying to protect. But Jefferson had it differently. Jefferson wrote about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, I don't talk much about the political history here, the Jeffersonianism, but it's very consistent with what Katherine and I were talking about a few moments ago. The great objective for Smith was that the bulk of the working population be happy in their lives, not be miserable. Smith repeatedly talks about their being happy and their not being miserable. Those are, I believe, his words. And where did that come from? I think this was also part of the product of the turn away from predestinarian Calvinism. Calvin was very clear that the sole purpose for humans being on earth was the glorification of God. And by contrast, the people who were moving beyond Calvin, I think, for example, of William Robertson and his colleagues in the so-called moderate party in the Church of Scotland, very much emphasized the idea that a part of the divine intent for humans being on earth, if not the central part of the divine intent, was human happiness. So, and in the book, I give lots of examples historically of people in England and Scotland who wrote about this idea of human happiness being part of the divine intent for us. So in this respect as well, I think Smith, by emphasizing the importance of the happiness as opposed to misery of the population, was following in the wake of the turn away from predestinarian Calvinism, as of course was Jefferson, although that's of course a very different story.
Tressa, does that answer your question? Is there any follow-up you'd like to add?
No, that's fine.
Okay. Thanks ever so much.
Good.
Next, I'm going to turn to David Horton-Carter, if you're able to come off mute and ask your question to Professor Friedman.
Hi, do we have liftoff? Am I audible?
Fire away, we've got you.
Well, I've been involved in social enterprise ideas projects for about a decade, and what interests me, why I'm here really, is the potential of progressive economics to help change the game, how we learn the lessons of history to improve the future. So the question that I had was, how do you think we can shift these entrenched religious grounded views like opposition to estate taxes to enable government policies that can support progressive grassroots ideas when there would otherwise be enough public opposition to make governments shy away?
My sense is that in the context of American politics, part of the way to do that is to address these religious concerns right up front, rather than either be ignorant of them or recognize that they exist but turn away from them. I think people who would like, for example, to not just retain but tighten the inheritance tax in the United States, the estate tax, as I would, people who think that we need higher tax rates on top bracket incomes, as I would, people who think we need tighter regulations in a variety of industrial settings, as I would, ought to turn to the religious thinking and see to what extent they can take messages from it that would be helpful in their program, rather than abandoned entirely to the right wing the use of, the command over religious language, religious imagery, religious thinking. Now, that may be a very parochial American answer, but that's how I see it here. We have many forms of symbolism in the United States that in principle, you could imagine being part of the intellectual and political property of people everywhere across the American spectrum. But as a matter of fact, historically, in recent decades, the left has ceded those pieces of imagery and rhetoric to the right. I think that's a mistake, because people, just repeat what Catherine and I were talking about before, the secularization hypothesis did not turn out to be right in the United States. People did not abandon their religious commitments. They may have evolved, but they haven't abandoned them. And therefore, to turn away from this important anchoring of people's ideas, I think is a big political mistake.
Thank you. And David, of course, one of the former Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, has been very much supportive of new economic thinking ideas in the last few years. And so we're really seeing the religious leaders, in at least in the form of Rowan Williams, using their position and their platform to promote some really creative and I think really bold and necessary economic thinking that we need in discussions today. I'm going to pass now to Susan Murray to help with some of the questions that from people who are unable to come off mute. So over to you, Susan.
Thanks, Catherine. So Frank Ledwith would like to hear more about, linked to the last question, I think, how religion has led to so many people voting against their own economic interests. And we have another question from an anonymous attendee that says, what does Professor Friedman think of the notion capitalism and the rise of religion?
I'm sorry, what do I think of of what was the last part, Susan?
Capitalism and the rise of religion. rather than Religion and the Rise of Capitalism, so the opposite of your book title.
I see. Well, let me take on that one first. Economists, including me, tend to be very comfortable with notions of two-way causation. I'm no exception in that regard. And even though my new book is primarily about the causation running from religious thinking to the economic thinking, I also discuss some in the book the causation going the other way of developments in the economy itself and also in economic thinking feeding back to influence religious thinking. So, for example, one of the issues that I emphasize is that especially by the time we got to the middle of the 19th century in America, when people had the clear view that by exercising their own choice and action, human agency, they were able to effect in this country such an enormous impact on their personal economic well-being, it just seemed implausible to them that there was nothing that they could do to influence their spiritual ultimate destiny. So this is an example of how the economics and the economic thinking fed back onto the religious thinking. Incidentally, to revert to one of the earlier questions, that was a lot of what the Weber-Tawney debate was about, which way the causation went. Now, the first part of the question was, you have to remind me what the first part of the question was.
Sorry, the first part of the question was from a different participant. Could you say more about how religion has led to so many people voting against their own economic interests?
Yes, there are several strands of this, but the most important one to which I would point is the distinction in people's view of the millennium and the end of times, what religious scholars call eschatology. This may seem in other countries like not a big deal, but one of the astonishing, at least astonishing to me, facts that I point out in the book is that nearly half of the American population thinks that the second coming will either definitely or probably occur by 2050. Well, that's not very long away. Now, historically, there was a great dispute in terms of what the arrival of the millennium meant. Some people whom we refer to as pre-millennialists had the view that the world as we know it would end before the millennium foretold in the 20th chapter of Revelation, and other people thought the world would end only after that. Well, once again, this is something that might or might not have triggered a major competition of worldviews, but in fact it did. And the key issue is whether there is any point in trying to improve the world. There's a kind of inherent pessimism, a kind of fatalism about attempts to improve the world that goes along with pre-millennial thinking. Somebody mentioned before evangelicals in the United States, and it turns out that probably the single most important theological belief that at least American evangelicals have in common is this premillennialism. There are many other aspects as well, but I would point to the premillennial view of most of our evangelicals, the idea that because the world as we know it will end with the second coming, attempts at changing the world are not of value. What matters is saving souls and preparing people for this event when it comes.
Goodness, it's an extraordinary figure and all the layers of implications that has for attitudes to the world, to fellow human beings, to future generations, to politics. I tell you what, Professor Friedman, that's the one that's going to keep me awake at night for the next few weeks. That's just a statistic that's going to really embed in my brain. And yes, very, very terrifying on many levels. We've got a few more questions coming through now. First from John Sturrock, and then after that, Donald Mcrae. So if you could both be ready to come off mute. John first, and I just encourage any women who are joining us tonight, please do put your questions. We don't want to have just a Q&A of our bloke friends. But first to you, John Sturrock.
Thanks, Catherine, and thanks, Professor. What a fascinating seminar and ideas these are. Religion and religiosity are very broad concepts, and I wonder if we need to differentiate amongst different religions or even among different denominations to gain a better understanding of their possibly different impact on the rise and development of capitalism.
Well, the answer, of course, is yes. What I especially point to in the origins of modern economic thinking was what was going on between these two factions. They wouldn't have called themselves denominations, but the two factions within the Church of Scotland at this time, the moderate party led by William Robertson and others who, the moderates called themselves moderates. The other group, the predestinarians, had a variety of names. Today in the scholarly literature, they're mostly referred to as evangelical. So that's mostly within the English-speaking Protestant world. As we come forward, and especially in the United States with our extremely diverse population, of course, it matters a lot which view of religion one has. We have a very large Roman Catholic population in the United States. We have a small but very active Jewish population, and increasingly we now have a Muslim population of size, and we have a Hindu population of size, and now we have a large Chinese and Korean population, although interestingly the Koreans tend to be mostly Protestants. And yes, coming forward to today, exactly as you're suggesting, the polling data that we have indicate very different policy ideas, very different political preferences among all of these groups. So for example, in terms of, I mentioned how Protestant evangelicals are a great exception when it comes to being opposed to estate taxation. A great exception on the other side is Jews. Jews in the United States, Jews in the United States tend to have extremely high incomes, much higher than the average of the population, and yet Jews overwhelmingly support having estate taxation. So one could go through a whole array of religious preferences. For historical purposes, however, I think we have to look at the English-speaking Protestant world. That's the world in which Smith and Hume lived. That's what dominated the United States throughout the 19th and on into the early 20th century. So for historical purposes, it really is the Protestants that we're looking at.
Fantastic. Thank you. We've got a few more coming through, and I'm just going to reiterate, if there are any women, please do ask your questions. But for the moment, going to turn to Donald Mcrae, and then after that to Ian Marr, and then to Douglas Chalmers. But to Donald Mcrae first, if you can come off mute and ask your question.
Well, thank you, Professor. I found that most illuminating presentation, and I really look forward to reading your book. All of us recognize the power of markets, and particularly the right wing. Adam Smith, of course, rightly recognized that markets have to be regulated, and they actually are more efficient if they are regulated properly. But I've noted over the years that the right wing and right-wing thinking doesn't seem to take account of the need to regulate markets or indeed have rules. So I just wondered, have you any explanation for this? Why is there this obvious distaste in right-wing thinking for good regulation or rules?
It's very rare to come up with a regulation that doesn't interfere with what somebody wants to do. And there are people who don't like to be interfered with, and then people have different views about whether to subordinate their personal freedom of action to the public good. To take an example of regulation here in the United States, which I believe you have as well, we do not have the choice as individual American citizens whether to put a catalytic converter on the tailpipes of our automobiles. This is not a small matter. It adds well over $1,000 to the cost of every vehicle to put a catalytic converter on it. But we don't leave it to individual American citizens to decide, do I want to have that on my car, or am I content with all of the pollution coming out of the back? It's a matter of law. You can't sell a car in the United States without one. Now, does this inconvenience people? Well, of course, we're talking about making people spend more than $1,000 extra for every car that they buy. Are there people who are unhappy about it? Yes, I suppose so. Are there people who say, well, yes, I do care about the public welfare and the pollution, but I would just as soon save the $1,000? Well, sure, we have lots of those people, but that's what public choice and public policy is about. And I think again and again in one area or another, the point becomes even more relevant when we're talking about people who are not consumers. I gave the example of car buyers, but how about producers? Imagine you are selling some good and it turns out that the cheapest way for you to make it is in a way that threatens the physical safety of your workers. Well, and I'm guessing your country and certainly in mine, the authorities are very likely to propose regulations to say, you can't do that. You have to have certain safety standards involved so that people don't lose hands and legs and whatever, and maybe get crushed by heavy machinery. And a lot of times these safety regulations are expensive. So people have a self-interest in not having regulation opposed to them. And then some people view their self-interest versus the public interest in one way. We refer to those as being on the right. Others have a different view. We refer to those as being on the left. The one thing that would be wrong, and I tried to emphasize this before, the one thing that's wrong is to associate Smith purely with the anti-regulatory view. There were lots of regulations that Smith was for. In economics, we have a concept which we call an externality, meaning that a catalytic converter is a good example. When stuff comes out of the tailpipe of my car that influences people other than me, and so we call that an externality. Smith did not have the vocabulary of externality, but he absolutely had the idea in the passage of The Wealth of Nations, in which he's explaining why he is in favor of all of these tight regulations on banks. Incidentally, he's writing only 6 years, book is published only 6 years after the Scottish banking crisis of 1772, with worst crisis in Scotland in 2 generations. Smith says he's in favor of these banking regulations for the same reason that he favors the rules that require firewalls between the row houses in Edinburgh. A perfect example of an externality. So even though he didn't have the vocabulary for it that we use today, he absolutely had the concept.
Fantastic. Professor Friedman, we're coming to the end of our time. Would you be happy taking 3 questions at once and then answering them fairly quickly, just doing a bit of grouping to try to bring in the last few questions? Is that okay?
I'm very honored to be here, and I'm at your disposal. Whatever you want to do is fine with me.
I think we could easily relax into the evening and keep talking, but unfortunately we don't have that luxury of time. But I'm going to ask in succession Ian Marr and then Douglas Chalmers to ask their questions, and then also Stephen Woolman, who was kind enough to be the instigator of tonight's event. But Ian, Douglas, and then Stephen, and then you'll be able to answer them hopefully in the last few minutes we have left. Ian first.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little on the relationship between Smith and Calvinism. To what extent was he reacting to it? To what extent was he drawing on it? In the way that you mentioned earlier, on drawing on sort of evangelical ideas in the United States. To what extent was he drawing on it or reacting to it? And what lessons does that hold for contemporary political economic thinking in relation to religious thinking?
Great, thanks, Ian. Douglas, over to you.
Thank you very much. Despite the fact Labour's policy in 1945 talked about building a new Jerusalem, and the fact that the Methodist Church was strong in the Welsh miners, Tony Blair's head of communications, Alistair Campbell, famously said, "We don't do God here." Do you think that helps explain why there's less of a link between evangelicals and right-wing economics in the UK? Do we not do God in reality?
Fantastic, great questions. And finally to Stephen Woolman, who is the person responsible for this evening's event happening. Stephen, if you're able to come off mute. Stephen, can you hear us there? Professor Friedman, why don't you start with, oh, we got you, Stephen, fire away.
Ben, the invisible hand. Was Adam Smith lucky to have alighted on such a powerful image?
Brilliant.
The first thing I'm going to do is to duck the second of those questions. I don't think of myself as an expert on UK politics, and so I think it would not be right for me to opine on the Welsh miners and the Tony Blair's politics. So I mean, that's just beyond me. On the first question of the relationship between Adam Smith's thinking and and Calvin, I think it goes the other way around. I think what powerfully enabled Smith's thinking was the turn away from predestinarian Calvinism, the more optimistic and benign view of human nature that came with the new thinking, the idea that no, humans are not utterly depraved, the idea that we can, in contrast to human depravity, the great metaphor of the time was John Locke's phrase, the candle of the Lord, meaning reason. Locke argued that we are all born with the candle of the Lord if we only are willing to use it. On predestination itself, Calvin famously taught that whether any individual is going to be saved or sentenced to an eternity of punishment in the afterlife is a choice made not only before the person is born, but before the world was even created, and therefore that there was nothing an individual could do, no choice, no action that would have any determinative effect whatsoever. And by contrast, the post-Calvin view was that yes, all individuals are capable of being saved, and moreover, that the choices we take and their actions are able to use the phrase of John Tillotson, who was the first Archbishop of Canterbury, appointed after the Glorious Revolution in 1688. Tillotson argued that people are able to cooperate with God in achieving their salvation. So I think it's these non-Calvinist, post-Calvinist, I hesitate, but even anti-Calvin ideas that were the key enablers of Smith's thinking. Now, Stephen's question about the invisible hand is a very interesting one. I don't think Smith himself devoted a lot of importance to the phrase of the invisible hand. It is, of course, what we today associate with the competitive market mechanism and its effect in allowing people who act on only their own self-interest to make others better off. But Smith used the phrase only 3 times in his lifetime. He used it once in his essay on the history of astronomy. Most people think there it's a jocular reference. He used the phrase once in the theory of moral sentiments, and he used the phrase only once in the Wealth of Nations. And even in the Wealth of Nations, it's not a very good example for illustrating what we today regard as the invisible hand. It turns out this is a phrase that had been very standard, had been used thousands of times before Smith. Again, I don't think he attached any great importance to it, but we certainly do. And for better or worse, whether he would have liked it or not, that's the label that we give to his central idea. I think it's a perfectly good label, and I'm happy to use it even if he didn't.
It just shows the power of metaphor in communicating an idea, doesn't it? How it's run and run. Professor Friedman, it's been a delight for me to speak with you this evening, and I'm even more delighted to be able to pass over to Ken Barker, the incoming chair of the David Hume Institute, to share a vote of thanks.
And thank you for a delightful conversation, Catherine.
My pleasure.
Well, thank you, Catherine. One of the compensating joys of this strange time is that the academic community has become global and accessible through the technology we're using today. And so it is that through Lord Woolman's kind introduction, we're able to see and hear Professor Ben Friedman, one of the world's leading economists, speak and answer questions as if we were sitting with him in that beautiful library at Harvard University. However, our enjoyment of these events depends on speakers giving up their valuable time. And so I want to sincerely thank Professor Friedman on behalf of the virtual full house here today. As a graduate of Glasgow University, where the subject is still called political economy, I've never bought into the idea that human beings are desiccated, deterministic spending machines, maximizing their personal utility without social, ethical, or religious dimensions to their actions. Ben struck a blow for fuller understanding of economics with his celebrated book, The Moral Consequences of Economic Growth, and Religion and the Rise of Capitalism takes us a step further in this welcome direction. I'm well into reading this, and as well as being elegantly written, it brings together economics, politics, moral philosophy, theology, and history in a way that very few academics could, and is extremely insightful as a result, as all of us have witnessed in today's event. Those with this intellectual breadth are typically called Renaissance men or women. Ben might more appositely be called an Enlightenment man and a true successor to Adam Smith and David Hume. Thanks too to Dr. Trebeck for steering our conversation. We at the David Hume Institute greatly admire Catherine's work on the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, and her ideas in combining economic and ecological well-being clearly made her a perceptive chair today. Thank you to all of those who have attended today. As I say, it was a full house, and a special thanks to those who asked those stimulating questions. A recording of this event will be available on our website, davidhumeinstitute.com, in a few days. There you will also find details of our next virtual event, the Double X Economy, Scotland's Secret Weapon, with Professor Linda Scott on February 23rd. None of this is possible without your support. As well as events like these, the Institute also undertakes original research and indeed is currently working on a large study, the Action Project, which is bringing people from across Scotland together to consider what we need to do to move towards a country that is more prosperous, sustainable, inclusive, and fair. And you can find details on how to contribute to our work on the website. With that, I will bring today's event to a close. Thank you all very much.